Good morning. Let me start by reading out an article from the Telegraph UK paper on the 9th of June. I'll read some of this article, not all of it. This is by Hamish, Bretton on the 9th of June. Quoting, as a former tank commander, I can say one thing for certain. Putin's demoralised conscripts are utterly unprepared for the shock action now hitting their lines. Ukrainian armoured formations are beginning to meet Russian forces in battle, and they are going to pulverise Russia's defensive lines. I'm confident for one simple reason. Ukraine will follow the Western ideology of manoeuvre warfare in a combined arms context, while the Russians will follow Soviet doctrine, relying on attrition and numbers. The Russians will find that the armour of Western tanks is far more resilient than flesh and bone. They will die in great numbers and they will lose. The core idea of manoeuvre warfare is mission command. Commanders at all levels understand the top-level end state and are given the flexibility to conduct the battle as they see fit to achieve victory. The Ukrainians are well versed in this style of warfare, which allows them to be agile and adapt their plan to the situation on the battlefield as it unfolds and changes. The Russians do not follow this doctrine. They are given strict roles in the execution of plans, drawn up at the top, and cannot change them, even when things are going badly wrong. This has been made evident time and time again in Ukraine, where Moscow's tanks have all too often been blown to pieces without firing a round. On top of this, we can add the simple fact that Kiev's forces have proved far superior in their adoption of combined arms warfare. This means using tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power in harmony to achieve their objectives. Each element brings its own capabilities, and together they are far greater than the sum of their parts. The effect is devastating. Nearly 4,000 Russian tanks have been destroyed because they were not properly protected by infantry and air defence. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have died because they were not properly supported by artillery and tanks. Getting this form of warfare takes intelligence and training. You need the right equipment and effective doctrine. The Ukrainians have this. I estimate that their tank brigades have had around 8 weeks to perfect combined arms warfare. Around the same time, I would have allocated to train the Royal Tank Regiment under my control to be an effective combined arms fighting force. And they certainly have the right equipment. The Challenger and Leopard tanks leading the spearhead vastly outmatch what's left of Russia's heavy armour, while sophisticated precision artillery is providing withering fire for the advance. Conversely, Russian recruits appear to be given a few days of training, a little ammunition, and are then thrown into the meat grinder with a life expectancy surely measured in days. They might as well be gunning them down on the training fields. It would be faster, cheaper, and about as combat effective. There will certainly be no rescue from the air. The Russian Air Force should be a massive operational threat, but it seems that its pilots have opted to hide in the confines of the officers' mess rather than face the excellent Ukrainian air defences. And he continues in this vein, comparing Putin to Hitler. Much like Adolf Hitler, at the end of his war, Putin appears to be holed up in his bunker, being fed lies, making the wrong decisions while the sharks circle. What's unfolding in Ukraine now could go down in history as one of the great tank actions, alongside Cambrai, Kursk and the Arras counterattack. It will certainly go down as the end of Moscow's illegal invasion, and perhaps the beginning of the end of Putin. That was written by Colonel Hamish de Bretton, former commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment in the United Kingdom. Just want to follow that up with one quick title from a Kiev Post article talking about the fact that Ukraine is using older model tanks, and the title is, "They may be old, but they can still outshoot the Russians." Now, why did I read this today? Well, yesterday we saw the first video footage emerge of a Challenger tank burning and in flames. The Challengers, which were introduced to Ukraine some time ago, but reportedly MI6, the UK intelligence agency, had specifically instructed the Ukrainians not to deploy the Challengers to the front line. that they were to be held in the rear and not in frontline combat. Now, that was due to the less than impressive debut of the Leopard 2s when they started the offensive in the beginning of June, on the 4th of June. So the Challengers, we saw some footage of them about 2 weeks ago, blurred out backgrounds so they couldn't be geolocated, but with what's become known as cope cages on them. The cages, the small mesh cages put on top of tanks to attempt to thwart Lancet and FPV drone attacks. So we know that they were there. Yesterday, the first video footage emerged of the Challenger tank. Furthermore, there is some speculation that the Challenger may not have fired a single shot, in that it may have been destroyed by Russian artillery at some distance from the operational line of contact. So if we add that, now that's the first footage we've seen confirming a Challenger that has been lost. It's not to say there haven't been others destroyed or damaged, but footage hasn't emerged yet, but we have confirmation of one. Now, this adds to the list of 30 plus visually confirmed, destroyed or heavily damaged Leopard tanks in Ukraine. So why did I read that piece? Because I think that piece shows how the Western media has been intentionally leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. That article was written on the 9th of June 2023. So that was written 5 days after the offensive began, and we saw the ineffectiveness of the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys in the area, in the minefields of Robotny. Surely a more accurate piece to be written at that time would have started with something like, as a former tank commander, I can see that Ukraine needs to adapt quickly to what appear to be challenging and unexpected scenarios. Perhaps a lack of experience and familiarity with new NATO-supplied equipment and light to non-existent air support puts Ukraine into uncharted territory. Not to mention the use of tank-killing aerial drones. Now, something like that, such an article phrased that way, I feel would have given the Western public a chance to understand the challenge that is actually being faced by the Ukrainians and not misleading them into thinking that the offensive would be an early success. Content such as it was delivered by Mr. Bretton Woods, Bretton Gordon, leads people to distrust the media and ultimately decrease the support that Ukraine is so desperately seeking from the West. So, yes, while operationally it is big news today that a first Challenger has been destroyed, I don't think it's any surprise. I think after the Leopard debut was seen to be so unimpressive that they were shown not to be super tanks, not Wunderwaffen, but just tanks like many other tanks. They suffer from the same challenges here in Ukraine, such as very densely mined minefields, a lack of air support on the Ukrainian side, the use of drones, which I doubt very much that Colonel Hamish de Bretton Gordon, when he was commanding the Royal Tank Regiment, that he had a great deal of experience dealing with Lancet drones and things like that, and was quite probably operating in an environment where, when he was commanding tanks, that they did have Western air superiority, providing them cover from above. Okay. I will go through the update, the daily battle update. Just a couple of things I want to cover off beforehand, though. Just some thoughts on Turkish President Erdogan's meeting a few days ago in Sochi with President Putin. Now, as I mentioned there was a lot of talk about the Black Sea Grain Initiative being discussed there. Turkey had previously brokered that deal. However, I don't think that we're going to see a restart of that deal. We have two very opposing positions. The Russians are quite clearly saying that they will only consider restarting that deal if they get evidence from the West that things like sanctions on their agricultural fertilizer products are lifted, proof that Russian freighters and tankers are able to port or dock in ports and that insurance will be provided to them and all of those sort of things. Confirmation that those sea routes through the Black Sea would not be used for any sort of arms smuggling. I touched on an article yesterday about this, a report of strikes yesterday in the Odessa ports on a factory or an industrial facility where reportedly components for sea drones, surface craft, unmanned surface craft had been provided and were being assembled into these sea drones. So I think perhaps that might be an example of Russian President Putin is speaking about there, is that components for sea craft, autonomous vehicles have been shipped in allegedly empty freighters coming into the Odessa ports to pick up grain, but have been dropping off military cargo. So that deal is not going to go ahead. Ukrainian spokesperson, when mentioning this, said that while they would wait to hear more from Turkey, that they would not be making any considerations or concessions to get the grain deal re-established. The grain deal clearly is troublesome for Europe, as about 60% of the Ukrainian grain actually goes to feed Europe, developed nations in Europe, with a smaller percentage going to the developing nations, although the Western media would probably have you believe it was the other way around. Anyhow, I must credit Alexander Mercouris from the Duran for really this thought, but it's something that I wanted to mention here because I think he's correct, is that perhaps what we are seeing with Erdogan speaking to Putin, on the surface of it, grain deal talks, but really it's other things being discussed underneath. And you could extrapolate out from that if a relationship between Turkey were to strengthen with Russia and grow, remember that Turkey already has an S-400 air defense system from Russia, so they have some military relationship there, that this could become the first example of a NATO nation leaving NATO. And the reason I'm jumping to that is because there are reports that China may have provided some sort of an invitation to Turkey to come and talk about joining BRICS. We have seen Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina in the last BRICS gathering be admitted. We know that there are about 20 more nations who have indicated an interest in joining BRICS. It would certainly make some level of sense for Turkey to consider doing so, joining BRICS. But if they were to do that, one would expect that would then make them effectively incompatible with the NATO defensive organisation. Who can say? But I think it is at least a sign of the shift in allegiances across the world as BRICS forms and grows in strength, as nations begin to now have an option and begin to sit down and consider, okay, if we were to leave Western EU and NATO, what would we do? Well, we could now trade with BRICS. Turkey, for whatever reasons, is not likely to enter the EU, but are already a member of NATO, and they do sit a fine line or upon a fence in their dealings with NATO and with Russia, given their geographic location. They're so close to Russia. Turkey is instrumental in trade through the Black Sea. They control all of Russia's access out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and they control Europe's access from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. So as Iran, Russia, and China begin to grow ties through BRICS, Turkey may look at that and see benefits in joining BRICS, and then that would become a point where the question of their suitability for NATO any longer would rise, I'm sure. Okay, just some information from Russian Minister for Defense Sergei Shoigu. So he was giving a press conference, a large televised video conference yesterday to leaders of the Russian armed forces, and he covered off a number of topics. A couple here I'd like to just cover here with you. One of the things that he said was, since the beginning of the so-called offensive, this is the Ukrainian offensive, it started on 4th of June. Since the beginning of the so-called offensive, the enemy losses were 66,000 men and 7,600 pieces of armament. Now, that's a very large number, 66,000, when we consider that offensive has been operating for about 3 months now. It's just been 3 months. It's just starting into its 4th month. For those of you who follow the channel and follow the Ministry of Defence daily reports, then we do see, if those numbers are correct, then we do see daily numbers that are large in terms of Ukrainian killed and wounded. In a report I did about a week ago, that day the reporting indicated about 1,000 men had been killed in that day. So if those numbers are near accurate, then over a 90-day period, 66,000, I mean, that could be right if those numbers are accurate and sustained. And by all accounts and many indicators, Ukraine is suffering very heavy losses in terms of men. But this makes you then wonder if this news gets out, if this gets picked up by the Western press, what impact this will have upon support for Ukraine when you look at the map of Ukraine and see the area that Ukraine has managed to recapture, the land it has advanced across and been able to hold in that 3-month period, is quite frankly a tiny snippet of the land which Russia has captured. When people start to consider the value of that for the trade of 66,000 men, I wonder if some of them will begin to question the value in that, and if that will start to impact or undermine Western support to continue supporting this sort of offensive. Even if we do admit that Ukraine may go into a defensive position now and get through the autumn and then through the winter, and let's say successfully in a defensive nature, they undergo the mobilisation, which they are starting now, which they are talking about. The mobilisation I covered off yesterday, some of the reported features of that, where they are now looking at allowing people with tuberculosis and HIV and mental conditions to be allowed to fight, apparently because they are struggling to find numbers of fit and healthy men to fight. Reports that members of the Ukrainian parliament are asking for the EU to extradite Ukrainian men who have fled Ukraine to the EU, send them back to Ukraine to fight. So even if Ukraine were to do this and was to build up a large army ready for next spring of 200,000-300,000 men, what shape will these men be in? What capability will they have? What actual level of commitment will they have to fight? Again, this week we have seen a number of videos. One which came out, which was originally launched on some Ukrainian Telegram channels, suggesting what you could see was from a drone a large number, I don't know, maybe 20 men running along a line, and they were reportedly Russian soldiers who were surrendering. However, that video was quickly taken down off the Telegram channels and requests made not to post it, as it was actually Ukrainian men surrendering and running to the Russian lines. So, the more that you scrape the barrel to get your military men, those people who are unwell, infirm, who have already tried to avoid being conscripted, their commitment to fighting is obviously going to be low. They're far more likely to give up their weapons, to wave the white flag, and to find a way out and keep themselves alive. So even if Ukraine does manage to do that and get itself a large army, it still won't have addressed issues of shell supply, It won't have addressed issues of its inability to use Storm Shadow missiles. It seems as though the Storm Shadow missiles that were supplied may well have been destroyed in that Russian missile strike a few weeks ago. We haven't had any reports of Storm Shadow attacks since about the 7th of August. It's a month now. They won't have addressed the fact that Russia has been undergoing a stealth mobilization and is ready to mobilize more when it needs to. That we have constant reporting of Russian industry producing more aircraft, producing more weapons, and operating around the clock. So even if you do suggest that Ukraine will build that new army for next spring, what will they achieve on that map? How many of those relatively untrained and unwilling men will die to capture another small parcel of land? I don't see the logic in it. I don't see how you can look at it and purely by maths figure out how that can expect to be successful. But as someone in the comments of one of these videos said to me the other day, that it is tragic what is going on here, that it's madness. And I said to them, it is madness, but what I think underpins this madness is business. And I think that is the only reason that I can fathom and get to as to why Ukraine and the West would want to continue this into next year, is because there is a certain element of the West and Ukraine who are making fantastic money, making coin hand over fist through this war. And they don't want that to stop, regardless of the impact it will have on the people of Ukraine and the nation of Ukraine. And again, if you step back and take a look and have a think about Ukraine as a nation now, it's in terribly poor condition. It's lost 11, 12, 13 million of its people. Many of them will never come back. It's lost possibly, some people are reporting up to 300,000 dead in this conflict in a year and a half of fighting. 20% of the country is no longer Ukraine. Now, regardless of where you sit on the ownership of this land, what I mean by that is that Russia occupies that land and is not going to be giving it back. If this offensive continues to fail, and if Russia then goes on the offensive, it's quite possible that they will go all the way to the Dnieper and take Odessa, and then it'll be 40% of Ukraine will then become Russia, and Russia won't give it back. And at that stage, the options will be that Ukraine gives up because they cannot fight anymore and win, or NATO decides to get into the conflict. And as I've said many times, I don't think NATO really wants to get into the conflict. Again, some simple math. Russia has 140 million people. They're on a war footing. They're producing war 24/7 around the clock. You would have to take Germany with its population of 84 million, the remaining 20 million Ukrainians, and Poland's 40 million, and put them all together to fight, and then you've got at least parity in numbers, but you still lack experience. The Polish and the Germans don't have the experience that the Russians have in the fighting, and neither Poland or Germany are on a war footing. They're not facing an existential threat like Russia is. So I don't think that NATO wants to get into this fight. If the only reason that NATO would get in here would be because the Americans were to lead them in there, because the Americans wanted to do what they've done to Ukraine to other nations in Europe. But that, again, I don't really see the logic of that. I think very soon the US will realize and recognize that its real challenge on many levels is with China, and not with Russia. And that the US would have been far smarter to have avoided a conflict with Russia and instead become friendly with Russia and look to entice Russia to the West, so that when the time came that the US did need to go to war with China, it would have Russia as an ally, rather than now Russia and China so closely partnered. Anyhow, just going back to what Sergei Shoigu was saying, and it sort of aligns with what I've been saying here, but he said on the 1st of September, so just this week, 38 higher and 33 pre-university educational institutions of the Ministry of Defence began their work. Classes began for the first time at the newly established Military Engineering Academy in Nakabino, the Donetskaya Combined Arms Command School, and the Irkutsk Suvorov Military School. The total number of students and cadets was more than 60,000 people. At the same time, the 2023 enrolment was significantly higher than last year's. So Russia's military cadets and students are enrolling at higher numbers than before. The training programs are adapted to the experience of the special military operation. Special attention is paid to practical training, modelling, issues of organisation, and support of combat operations, use of weapons, military and special hardware, including new models. Cadets and Suvorov Military School students will study the basics of military and naval training, take courses in tactical medicine, army tactical shooting, and the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. So Russia is fully aware of the impact of drones in this conflict, and that they will continue to play a growing role in this conflict. As I mentioned a little while ago, Russia has formalized drone racing and laser tag. If you don't know what laser tag is a game where you play inside an urban building. It's set up as all sort of different rooms and scenarios inside. You wear a vest which has a little laser receiver, and you get a gun, looks like a machine gun, or a rifle or pistols, and they fire a burst of laser. And so you learn basically, or you play war, and you can learn military operational tactics in those environments. So Russia has made them official sports of Russia now, and they're going to support them and promote them, so that the youth and people throughout Russia will become proficient at flying first-person view drones, and at small arms urban conflict operations. Sergei Shoigu also went on and spoke of the delivery of 6 Ilyushin 76 MD-90 and 4 Tupolev 160Ms. With the Ilyushin, the MD-90 is a 2012 modernised version of the Ilyushin 76 that ended service in 1971. The Ilyushin 76s are the ones that were struck in the Pskov Air Base up in the north of Russia, up near Latvia, a week or so ago. They are a large transport craft. They can carry 52 tons, or one Ilyushin 76 can carry 126 parachutists, or 145 troops in single-deck arrangement, and 225 troops in double-deck arrangement. It can also be equipped as an air ambulance and house special equipment to carry 114 injured persons. So 6 more of those are being delivered, which will then replace the 4, I believe, that were 2 destroyed and 2 damaged, allegedly, in that attack on Pskov Air Base. The Tupolev, he mentions that 4 new Tupolev 160Ms. The Tupolev 160M is a supersonic variable swept wing heavy strategic bomber, an airborne missile platform. The Tupolev 160M is the biggest and heaviest Mach 2 plus military aircraft, and in its look, it is somewhat reminiscent of the Concorde, is sort of how it looks to me. The Defence Minister went on to speak of the Moscow Conference of International Security being a success, with 800 delegates from 76 nations in attendance. In including 26 defence ministers and 16 deputy defence ministers and chiefs of general staff. The heads of foreign defence ministries expressed support for Russia's foreign policy course towards strengthening multipolarity and readiness to further develop constructive cooperation with Russia in the defence sphere. We're hearing this term multipolarity a lot coming from the Russians and from BRICS. And this is very clearly what they are looking to remove, is the unipolarity world, with the United States as being the one super sole global superpower, moving to a multipolarity world. Now, people like John Mearsheimer talk about multipolarity worlds, and I think in his case he's probably talking about the big powers, so the US, China, and then Russia, perhaps in that order. I think when we're hearing this coming from BRICS and from Russia, they are perhaps considering it at even at a lower level than that, where they are talking about, with BRICS, enabling nations to operate, trade together without the established hierarchies. This is one of the reasons why the Indians are not keen on the yuan or the Chinese RMB as becoming the BRICS currency, as they believe that would then put China in an unfair position of power over the other BRICS nations. Instead, it looks like BRICS will develop a BRICS currency, which will be used between BRICS nations. However, in a way different to the way that the European Union has the euro, and the euro is used between those EU nations, the euro actually flows down to be a currency that the citizen, the individual, can use. With BRICS, I believe, their currency will be used between nations to settle trade. So it will be used at a national level, not at a citizen level. It won't become a BRICS dollar that people in Egypt will trade with people in India and in Russia. Instead, it will be done between the nation states, the governments, when settling oil deals and things like that. Yeah, just overall, Sergei Shoigu, again, his speech, just indicating how Russia is focusing and moving to that military footing with growth of their young cadets and students at the military schools, focusing on training them in things that they have learnt from the special military operation, adapting from that experience. Delivery of equipment, these large aircraft, strategic bombers and transport aircraft. And then finally, him indicating, a positive response from the deputy defence and defence ministers of these 76 countries to Russia's foreign policy course towards strengthening multipolarity. Again, here, this is a strengthening of the BRICS and a change in the world order. Okay, moving on to the battlefront update here. Just let me get to the map so we can see where we are. Okay, we'll start up the top in Kupiansk. So up here, Kupiansk, in the Kupiansk direction. The attacks launched by aviation as well as artillery of the Zapad group of forces have resulted in the neutralization of Ukrainian manpower and hardware close to Sinkovka, Peshenoye, Berestovye, and the Stelmachovka. These regions around here. So this is in that northern line, where the Russians are pushing from Svatova here and Sinkovka, moving across towards Kupiansk and to the Oskol River. Now, once that does happen, it's likely they will then roll down that Oskol River and join up with forces from Liman and take this area to the east of the Oskol River under Russian control. The enemy losses are reported as being 50 Ukrainian servicemen, 2 motor vehicles and 1 D-30 howitzer in this area. Now, if we come down a little bit to Liman, the Krasny Liman area here, here's where the centre group of forces are operating. They are using army aviation, artillery and the TOS-1 heavy flamethrower systems. 3 attacks by assault groups of the 63rd, 67th Mechanized Brigades and the Armed Forces of Ukraine have been repelled close to Torskoye and Chervonaya Dibrova. Torskoye is just here, just to the east of Liman. This Kremenaya, just above it, this forested area is where there is a lot of fighting going on in this area here. Reports are that the Russians are making progress through the forested area, but with many Ukrainian counterattacks. The reported enemy losses in the Krasny Liman area are 70 Ukrainian servicemen, 3 armoured fighting vehicles, 1 Polish-manufactured Krab self-propelled artillery system, and 1 D-20 howitzer. Now, if we move down now to the Donetsk region, so here we have Donetsk city here, Bakhmut up here, Kramatorsk and Andrivka up this way. In the Donetsk direction, units of the Yug group of forces, in cooperation with aviation and artillery, have successfully repelled 4 attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine assault groups close to Kleshievka and Veseloye. In the Donetsk direction, according to some reports, Russian forces managed to advance in the direction of Krasnogorovka. That is here. Krasnogorovka is down to the southwest of, just to the west of Donetsk city. They were able to take one of the oldest strongholds in the landings east of the settlement. So the Russians pushing up from Marinka and westwards into the eastern area of Krasnogorovka. Reportedly, the enemy losses were up to 225 Ukrainian servicemen killed and wounded. This area in Donetsk is where we have seen the heaviest Ukrainian losses. It does appear as though there is constant attacks being made by the Ukrainians, often organised into just small groups of infantry without support of armoured equipment. So the report is that the losses in the last 24 hours are 225 Ukrainian servicemen killed and wounded, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 9 motor vehicles, 1 US manufactured M777 system, and 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system. In addition, 1 control point for Armed Force of Ukraine drones has been destroyed near Pervomaysk, and a control point of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade near Ugledar and the 8th Mountain Assault Brigade have been hit near Razdolovka in the Donetsk People's Republic. Now in the south Donetsk direction, units of the Vostok group of forces have inflicted a comprehensive fire attack on 2 Ukrainian manpower and hardware concentration areas near Ugledar and Makarovka. On the Voremsky sector, the Voremsky ledge here, the Ukrainians launched several attacks with infantry supported by armoured vehicles, but to no avail. The actions of 1 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance group has been disrupted close to Urozhne. This is just the Urozhne is here. This area, this Veremka ledge, is where from here from Naskuchne down here, down to Staromayorsk and Urozhne, is where the Ukrainians have pushed down, but they seem to have in the last week paused their advance further south beyond Urozhne. There was talk when they had got down to Urozhne and were starting to look towards Staromalinka that they would need to be careful that the Russians were not able to push in from the west at Priotne or from the east at Novodonetsk, because they were effectively getting themselves down into like a tube where they could be pinched off at the top and they would be trapped. That they would need to widen this area by pushing west towards Priotny or pushing east towards Novodonetsk. We haven't had a great deal of reporting of that occurring. It seems that instead the Ukrainian focus has been to the west around Robotny. But just before we move on to the Zaporozhye region and Robotny, The reported enemy losses in the South Donetsk region were up to 175 Ukrainian servicemen killed and wounded, 4 motor vehicles, a D-20 and D-30 gun. So again, there we see high numbers of men, and not a great deal of equipment being reported as being struck. I do note, and I may put together another video today, another report, which I think gives an indication as to what has happened here and why we have seen such a high number of 175 men, but no reports of armoured equipment, or really just 4 motor vehicles being lost. Overnight came out a flood of videos reportedly around the front line where FPV drones were used in targeted attacks on infantry in small groups, but there were multiple of these attacks, 2, 3, 5, 7 men in each attack, it seemed, and it looked as though those attacks would have been successful in some respect in either injuring severely or killing those men. So I think that might be why we're starting to see some of these higher numbers of men reported killed, but with lower numbers of vehicles. Moving on to the Zaporozhye region here. Units of the Russian troops using aviation, artillery and heavy flamethrower systems have repelled 2 attacks by the 47th Mechanized Brigade close to Robotny. The Ukrainians launched several attacks with infantry supported by armoured vehicles, but to no avail. A similar situation developed on the Robotny-Verbova line. Now, Verbova is just here, just to the east of Robotny, where the armed forces of Ukraine could not break through the defensive line. Moreover, by the evening, there was information about a successful counterattack by the Russian armed forces. So there are reports coming through that, and again, this has been going on backwards and forwards for the last 2 weeks, that Robotny now has been officially taken and controlled by Ukraine, that Ukrainians have been able to capture some Russian trenches here at the southern end of Robotny. Then there is also reports that the Russians have mounted a counter-offensive and have managed to push the Ukrainians back out again. So right now, this appears to be in some sort of a grey zone. I don't think there is any clear ownership over or control over Robotny in its totality yet. There are some higher areas of terrain through here to the southeast and south of Robotny, in between there and Verbova. The Ukrainians have been attempting to get onto some of these higher areas of land here. Obviously, the height gives you an advantage if you're able to use artillery on lower targets. But the Ministry of Defence goes on to say that the enemy losses were up to 170 Ukrainian servicemen, 2 tanks, 3 armoured fighting vehicles, 4 motor vehicles, 3 M777 artillery systems, 1 M119 howitzer, 1 German-manufactured Panzerhaubitze 2000 self-propelled artillery system, 1 British-manufactured FH-70 gun, 1 D-20 and 1 D-30 howitzer. So again, in this area here, still heavy artillery battles going on with a lot of reported Ukrainian losses. 1 ammunition depot of the 46th Airborne Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has been destroyed near Orikov. So Orikov is just up to the north of Robotny. Up here, Orikov is up here. So reportedly an ammunition depot has been destroyed there. Now, if we just move south, let's turn that around again. Move ourselves a little bit south down to the Kherson region. Here we go. Kherson. The activity of the Ukrainian formations is also growing in the Kherson direction, where attempts are being made to bring forces to the islands and the left bank of the Dnieper. Russian troops are taking actions to eliminate the presence of the enemy in the area. So the Ukrainians are on the western side of the river, or the right-hand side of the river. When using left and right with rivers, my understanding is you travel down the direction of flow of the river, and when facing that direction, that gives you a right-hand side or your left-hand side. In this case, the Dnieper flows from the top of the screen down to the bottom, and so that puts the Ukrainian or western side on the right-hand side. The Russian-controlled area is on the left bank of the river. So here the Russians are reporting that the Ukrainians are trying to land into the islands and then across the river. In Kherson, the Ministry of Defense reports there are up to 40 Ukrainian servicemen, including 2 sabotage and reconnaissance groups, killed or wounded, 2 motor vehicles, and 2 D-30 howitzers. Now, just before I was putting this report together, excuse me, my cold is getting into my lungs. Just as I was putting this report together, on Telegram channels, reporting was coming out of a number of bombers, up to 8 Tu-95 Tupolev bombers, a number of Tu Tupolev 22 M3s, and swarms of Geran drones being launched. Now, they appear to have been targeted, or at least some of them, again, at the ports of Odessa. So if I can just move this so that you can see that. Here we have Odessa ports here, the Ismail port and the Reni port. Now, these ports of Ismail and Reni are on the Danube River, which is the border, runs along the border with Romania here. But reports are that they have again been struck, as have Odessa ports and possibly ones in Mykolaiv. So this whole region along here has again, for the last few nights, come under quite heavy drone and missile strikes. Okay, that's it for the frontline battle update for today. Thank you very much if you've watched it this far. I hope you're enjoying the reports. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you are enjoying these reports, please share them with someone else. I'm trying to grow the channel. I look forward to talking to you soon.